Well, hi everybody, Father Alex here. Welcome to another episode of the Godcast. Not only am I the host of the Godcast, I'm also the vicar of St Matthew's Church in Burnley. I'm also the author of Our Daily Bread from August to the Altar, a Priest Story, which is available in all good bookshops and online. Do check that out. If you'd like to follow me, you can find me on X at AlexDJFrost. My guest today on the Godcast is Colm Flynn. Colm is the Vatican correspondent for EWT News. I'm going to be talking about his work and his role there, and also his thoughts on recent events in the Church of England. So I do hope you enjoy this interview with Colm. If you do, then please subscribe to the YouTube channel. But for now, enjoy the interview with Colm Flynn.
Oh, by the way,
Well, I'm delighted to say that joining me on the Godcast today is Colm Flynn. Colm, how are you?
I'm doing really good, Father Alex, and it's good to talk to you. And I know it's a bit early to have the tree up. As you well know, in a previous life, you had that song. What was it called? We were,
Don't put your decks up in November. You can check that out. It's out there somewhere.
in my defense, I'm going to be traveling a lot over the next few weeks. So I'm getting it up nice and early this year.
I was thinking if there was some sort of theological thing I just missed out on, and it's just simply that, is it?
The theology of Colum. Get it up nice and early and extend the Christmas cheer.
Fabulous. So listen, you've just been away, haven't you? And it was fascinating to see that you've been, of all places, to Iraq and was it Kurdistan you've been?
Yeah, and Alex, that was my second time. I had been back in 2021 when Pope Francis visited Iraq. He was the first pope to ever go there. Pope John Paul II had tried in 99, but it was just deemed too unsafe. So Pope Francis had said for a while that he wanted to go. It was pushed back a bit. Then the pandemic hit. But he made the journey in 2021, and it was amazing to see, well, first of all, the amount of security that was protecting the Holy Father. But then hearing the people's stories who had been through ISIS, who had had their churches destroyed, had their communities destroyed, these little Christian villages in Kurdistan that were once these really strong places of vibrant Christian life, completely decimated. So we decided this year, being the 10th anniversary of the ISIS invasion, to go back and do a proper documentary talking to people about their memories of that time. And many of them fled. Most didn't return to their small Christian villages. So for the ones who did stay and the ones who came back, it was fascinating to talk to them about the strong faith that they had that kept them going. When they were told by ISIS, you have three options: convert to Islam, flee, or die. And, you know, it's just, it's incredible when you hear these testaments of faith.
And how strong and deep is their faith? You know, is it the actual bedrock of their lives?
Yeah, and especially for the Christian community because they're a minority there in Iraq. And even though ISIS have gone and they say in the country now that they have equality across the various religions, the Christians that I spoke to, they said that they still find it difficult, you know, to get a promotion at work, maybe to get a government position, all these little things. In fact, in actual fact, when we were filming outside the city of Mosul in a little town, there were these beautiful children. We were getting an evening sequence of the sun going down. It had that beautiful warm glow. And these children were playing. And then my translator started laughing. And he said, oh, the little girl just said, we can't play with those kids because they're Christians. Now, they were saying it and they were laughing, but in a lot of cases, this is what they're hearing at home. There's still, many Christians believe that they're treated as second-class citizens. And so, again, I was just amazed. It's always so reaffirming in my own faith to meet people who've really been through struggles, like struggles that we can never imagine, thank God. And to hear how they didn't give up on their faith. In fact, quite the opposite. Their faith helped them through it. It carried them through. When I'm sure you've heard this before, Alex, people say, why God? Why me? If this all-loving God is here, we're just living our life, a humble peasant family in this village. Why are we facing down the barrel of an ISIS gun? So it was incredible to hear the stories.
And is it part of the remit column of the Holy Father that when he does these trips, there's a legacy? I suppose it's a bit like when the Olympics come to town, isn't it? You know, what happens afterwards? Is that, in your experience, is that an important part of any visit?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and it's one that we ask often. What are the long-term effects of these trips? So I was just in Papua New Guinea and East Timor and Indonesia and Singapore Pope Francis went on the longest trip of his papacy, 40,000 miles. But for example, going to Papua New Guinea, where they have a big problem with tribal violence, these groups, communities up in the junglist regions that are killing each other, violent clashes. And the Pope went there and he calls for, to remember his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, we're all brothers and sisters, we all need to care for one another. He tried to condemn violence, live in peace. What we've always heard is that when the Pope is there on the ground, there is a reduction in crime. Last year we went to Lisbon for World Youth Day. City of 500,000 people, 1.5 million young people from all over the world came. And the police made a statement at the end saying they didn't have any reports of crime across the weekend when Pope Francis was there. And indeed, when I was in Iraq with the Pope, many of the people I was talking to, young Muslims, they had no idea who Pope Francis was. They didn't know anything about the Catholic Church, knew just a very little bit about Christianity. But I remember sitting outside her hotel in Baghdad talking to a young girl, and she was showing me her Instagram. And she said, "Oh, look, Papa Francis is here." And I said, "Do you know who he is?" And she said, "Yeah, like a big celebrity." She said, like Tom Cruise. They just thought this big celebrity was visiting. But what I noticed under it on Instagram, and remember, this is Instagram in Iraq, was that it said hashtag peace, hashtag brothers, and I forget what else. And I just thought, how often do these hashtags trend in a country that has such a brutal history of division and of war and of hurt and sorrow? So you do get the kind of the injection there and you get the immediate lift, but old habits die hard. And, for the Christians there, they've said that overall the Pope's visit does make a positive impact long term. It also gets people to look at it. They got a lot of investment from the United States. So people who don't really know what the situation is like in a country, some people, you say Papua New Guinea, where the heck is Papua New Guinea? So the Pope going there puts it on the map. And that can help a lot of charities and NGOs to pump in money. So, but it's a complicated question, and there's no long-term, immediate positive impact where everything just, peace reigns over the land. But what they kept saying to me were the seeds. They hope that a visit like Pope Francis, maybe not with the older generation, but with younger people watching on social media, something might just be planted in their mind and in their hearts as well.
Yeah, I want to talk about you a little bit, Colm, as well. But in that, I'm just thinking, well, what about in places like Ireland, where there's the historical stats and data that we can't deny that are there. How does the church go about rebuilding in a place where it is kind of it was a huge matter of importance, wasn't it, to families for years and years and years? And I was really sad to hear. There's been so many interviews talking about the Archbishop. We'll perhaps come on to that in a minute. But somebody had said, nobody goes to mass in Ireland anymore, which I'm not sure was absolutely true. But if it is, it's very sad. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's your first question about how do you rebuild a strong Catholic faith in a country like Ireland. That's the $1 million question. And the simple answer is it's going to be very difficult. And it will be done by missionaries coming in. And that's the ironic thing, that Ireland was the country that sent missionaries right around the world. And everywhere I travel to in Asia, Africa, Latin America, you meet these missionaries who have been there for decades, Irish people contributing to society, building schools and hospitals and orphanages, and respected, really respected in the places that they are, because the people see they do immense good. But in Ireland, there's been a sea change in people's attitudes towards the church. Some will say because of all the abuse crisis. Others will say, yes, that's part of it, but just a growing secularization anyway. People having other priorities with the Celtic Tiger, the economy booming. People saying, well, we don't need God in our lives anymore. But in pockets in the countryside, there still would be a strong attendance at Mass. But the average priest in Ireland, the average age of a priest is 70-something. There are only a handful of young men in the seminary. So again, we are relying on people coming in from India and mainly from Africa as well to be priests in Ireland. I went back and did a report about it recently because they had another wave of a government report about abuse in religious-run schools. Now, a lot of it had been known before and even had been settled by the church before, but this was the first time the government put it all together in one report, so it made all the headlines again. And I interviewed Bishop Dermot Farrell. He's the Archbishop of Dublin, where many of the schools were before his time. But he's the most senior Catholic in the city at the moment. And he was saying that the church really has to come to terms with what happened. it has to honestly and transparently own up to it and not be in denial. Many of the religious orders, sadly, are still not doing interviews. And I think it's just that they don't know what to say. They don't know how to sort out the kind of mess that had been left by a small number of priests and religious in the past. But unfortunately, one is too many. So even though the majority did great work, the whole church in Ireland has been tarnished now by the terrible deeds of a few religious. And by the way, Alex, first and foremost, they betrayed the children and they betrayed the families who put their trust in these children going to the schools. But they also betrayed their fellow priests and nuns who are being shouted at on the street, whose decades of work in third world countries now is going unnoticed, or people are just ignoring it. Yep. They've betrayed everyone, these people. And now the big question is accountability. But as you know, the Church of England facing this at the moment as well. When cases are going back decades, maybe the alleged perpetrator is long dead or in a nursing home, and it's very hard to try and know what to do next and how to make it right for the victims. And it does have to be made right. So once that happens, I think we can start to heal. But it needs a new vigour, new vitality in Ireland.
It's really fascinating, Colm. But I've done a few media interviews over the last few days, and originally it was because I was calling for the resignation of the Archbishop of Canterbury, but I wasn't calling for his head on a platter, and it seems to be that since his resignation has come, it's kind of the whole kitchen sink's being thrown at him, and I think that's denying the bigger issue. I think it's important to say that Welby wasn't the abuser in this matter. He was responsible for perhaps not calling it out quickly enough. Do you, when you look at events in the last few days, as opposed to more historical events such as in Ireland, what commonalities do you see? Do you see the same commonalities that you've just described?
Absolutely. And I watched that interview with Bishop Welby on Channel 4. And it's the same as what the Catholic Church has faced. And when I interviewed Bishop Dermot Farrell in Ireland, he said there was this fortress mentality. You protect the institution first. And many institutions are like that, religious and otherwise, that the institution must be protected first at all costs. He said I appreciated how frank he was in the interview. He said in many cases the blame was put on the victim. So when they heard that a priest was involved in a young person, was abusing a young person, the church would often say, well, we'll move the priest. Maybe it's the young person who's to blame here in some perverse way. That was the thinking at the time. But I saw that interview, and I've met Bishop Welby before, and my heart did go out to him a bit because this was well before his time. I think he was only a teenager when some of these acts were meant to have taken place. But I guess, that's the position he's in now. And, in retrospect and looking back, hindsight is always 20/20. But he admitted, I think, himself that probably he could have acted faster. And so that's the result. But it's the same with the church here. And they're always trying to play catch up. In fact, it's funny that we're talking about this because today, Alex, in the Vatican, they had a huge conference on safeguarding children. And it is one of the good things about the church, because it hit the Catholic Church so badly, because there were so many scandals, the church was really forced, and Pope Francis did this when he became Pope in 2013, to establish a safeguarding body called the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors. And they're right next door to me here in Rome at the moment. And they have to implement safeguarding measures that are spread across the church all over the world. So I know the experts and even the government in the recent report said that the religious run schools in Ireland today are some of the safest places to be because there are so many measures now in place. But still, people think too little too late, and still not enough has been done for those who have been accused and still not been called to justice.
I think it's really important to point out to people who kind of, I think the media can portray that these institutions just are awash with inability to face into these matters. But I have to say that in my own diocese here in Lancashire, in the Blackburn diocese, our protocols and procedures are stringent. There's a pathway that we have to follow, and woe betide if they're not followed. Colm, I'm really interested to know how a youngish guy like yourself,
I like the young. I didn't like the ish.
how somebody like yourself ends up in this role, working at the Vatican. Just give our listeners and viewers a bit of an insight how you got there.
I was always obsessed with working in television and radio, and growing up in County Clare in the west of Ireland. Even when I was in secondary school, I started working in our local radio station, Clare FM. I went and knocked on the door and said, "Can I have a show on the radio?" And they said, "No." And so I came back next week and I knocked again and kept insisting. And then I got some work experience. Was there for a few years, then moved to RTE, the public broadcaster of Ireland, worked on Radio 1, then worked on television, a show called The Today Show. But faith has always been something important to me in my life. I was an altar server. I have an aunt who was a nun, sadly passed away this year, but she was in Canada, sister of service, a great witness of just helping others so selflessly in the name of the faith. And then an uncle who was a priest in Angola in West Africa and would have seen the work that he did and just always been very comfortable around the church. And when I started working in Irish television, I was making some programs about Irish priests and nuns in different parts of the world who were doing incredible things. And because I was a contractor, after a certain period of time, I could provide them to other networks. And that's when I came across EWTN. I knew about it from my childhood because we had it in the house. But I sent this Catholic television network. It's based in Alabama, in Birmingham, Alabama. I sent them a video. 6 months later, they got back and said, "Okay, we'll take that program and can you do more work for us?" So I moved to New York. I was working mainly with the BBC for 5 years in New York City, BBC Radio. Still do a lot for them now. We're working on a Christmas special at the moment. And then I started doing more with EWTN. And then they said, "Colm," I think, Alex, they were badly stuck and no one was available. But they said, "Colm, can you come to the Vatican in Rome and be our Vatican correspondent?" And that has kind of morphed over the past couple of years to being an international correspondent. So now I just travel the world covering stories of faith, whether it's the war in Ukraine, it's famine in South Sudan, whether it's the slums in Buenos Aires, and how faith works in people's lives in good times and in the bad times. So that's what I do, Alex. That's in a nutshell.
So a couple of questions. I suppose, firstly, do you see your job as a vocation? And two, what is life like living in the Vatican area? Just give us a bit of an insight.
You know what? I don't want to say it's like a vocation because I feel like I'm degrading the work that great priests and nuns do who have a real vocation, who, we get to see the world. There's a lot of perks to the job. We get to meet fascinating people. But I do think, obviously at some stage in my life, I made a decision. Do I want to go down the secular route? And when I was living in New York, try and work with some of the big networks there or go to Los Angeles. And there's just something about the work that we get to do at EWTN. They're incredible stories. And they're stories, Alex, as you know, and you get to touch on them here in your podcast, that people are very interested in, but don't get much airtime on other networks. So there's kind of a gap in the market. And when we get a great story, whether it's the young boy who grew up in an orphanage in Michigan, run by Polish nuns who went on to create Domino's Pizza, Andrea Bocelli talking about how his faith has inspired him through his life and his music and a very cutthroat career. You're just inspired by these stories, and it's hard not to love them. And then when you see the reaction from people, there's a great appetite for these stories. And as I said, they're just not covered many other places.
It's really interesting. I was, I don't know if you saw it a few years ago, Colin, but I was on a BBC documentary, The Cost of Living Crisis, which was viewed by something like 12 million people. And it was a story about two parish priests, basically, and the outpouring afterwards. I thought the BBC were very brave to run the piece. I must try and send it to you. But actually, it was the outpouring that was the really moving thing. The amount of people that reached out who wanted to help, and which kind of restored my faith in the need of people that for something of a spiritual well-being of some description. Does that, although you say it's not a vocation, how much of part what you're doing is a spiritual connection as well?
Yeah, well, everything has a spiritual connection. The stories I cover have to have a spiritual connection. And I know that nowadays, because of maybe in general society, the kind of anti-church rhetoric and the anti-religious rhetoric, so sometimes I call it stealth religious broadcasting. So we will advertise, next week on the BBC World Service, Andrea Bocelli on his life, his music, and what drives him. But really at the heart of the program, when you listen to it then, of course, we'll open with his beautiful music and a bit about his backstory. But then when we get into the meat of it, the meat of the sandwich, it's him talking about his deep faith and how that is intertwined with his music and his life and the hardships he's had to face too as a blind man from the age of 12. So I think it's a massive part of it. And on social media now, where a lot of our stuff is watched, like on YouTube, again, I'm very conscious that a lot of young people might never click on a religious story. They might never click on a cross or an altar. But for example, I recently interviewed the CEO of Visa, the Visa Corporation. So a young person might say, oh, wow, this is impressive. Someone phenomenally successful, and you have a great thumbnail and a great headline. And then they watch it and they're talking about business and making it to the top in a very difficult industry in Manhattan. And then you hear me just say, and this is something you won't hear anywhere else. They're not going to ask this on BBC Newsnight or on Primetime, the Irish version of that. Me saying, but Mr. Al Kelly, what about your faith? You know, you're working here on the top of this skyscraper of Visa. You're earning $35 million a year. You don't need God. You're living the dream. You're living life. And then just to hear a profound answer for him. And then to see the comments, that's often what people pick up on. Or Harrison Butker, who won the Super Bowl. Everyone expects he's going to be interviewed about sport. And we talk a bit about sport. And then I saw you blessed yourself, Harrison, before you took that winning kick. Why was that? And you get this incredible answer. And it's just for young people, I think, there's a thirst for it because they're not getting it from other places. But again, we try to be clever and lead with the human interest stories and then make sure that the faith and spiritual aspect is central to them.
Yeah, Colm, interesting in a way you think we're not getting it from other places because, what you've just said is probably why I do the Godcast is because I'm finding that people do want to have a conversation about God and spirituality. And I've been very blessed to have some of the most famous politicians and musicians in our great British Isles, and they seem very happy when I ask them about faith to have a conversation. Politicians tell me directly what their faith is, but it seems to be that when it comes to be, maybe in Westminster, then that conversation has to be put under the carpet and not discussed. What do you think it is about faith? Has it just become untrendy?
Yeah, I think it's become untrendy and you have all these things battered around, that people might think you're fanatical. I remember when I started working in RTE, the Irish public broadcaster, there was a group of staff and my nickname was Father Colm. Not that I was going around kneeling, praying the rosary or anything, or going to daily mass. I would just, every now and then I'd say, you know what, I got a great story. There's this Irish nun who worked through apartheid in South Africa. We should get her. And they would nickname me Father Colm. So I guess if you're not that strong in your faith or your development, that can be quite intimidating. You think people are laughing at you. You think you're not being taken seriously. You think you're not going to get the promotions at work. And I think in a lot of cases that could be true as well. But I think when you get to the ordinary people, as you say, like I'll pitch ideas sometimes to different networks. And if it's a religious one, they might say networks outside of EWTN, because I still do a lot of freelance work. They'll say, I heard a phrase once, WBD, worthy but dull. And I say, oh, okay. But then you go and you can do it somewhere else on a podcast or on a YouTube video and you see the great reaction. And the good thing is you can read the comments and then it reaffirms you saying, no, there is a hunger for this. But why people are kind of shy to talk about it, I'm not sure, because I think people are fascinated. And even if people disagree, Alex, as you know, I'm sure if you're on a plane and you're sitting beside someone and they say, oh, I see the collar, you're a priest, and you say, yes, you tell them what they do. They'll say, oh, I'm really strong in my faith, and they'll talk to you about it. They might say, I think it's terrible, it's a load of codswallop, and here's why. And people who are indifferent are just kind of fascinated. So I think it's a win-win. And that's what I always say to young people up and coming in journalism. Don't be afraid to tackle these stories. And if you look at the census and the figures, the majority of people still do practice faith, or at least say that they're spiritual and open to spirituality. So the appetite is huge for it.
Yeah, I think it's so important what you're saying there, Colm. I mean, when I first became a priest, I felt my church was at the back of what I call the curve regarding social injustice. But just recently here in Burnley, we've had a huge issue with ketamine abuse, and very young people, kids as young as 12 and 13 have become addicted to ketamine. And I don't have a huge media profile, but it's reasonable. And I really spoke into that. And I've been delighted that the response I've had has been almost overwhelming by all sorts of people, speaking to chief inspectors and directors of public health. But to me, that is an affirmation, not of myself in any way, but an affirmation that there is still a job for the church in our society, and that is for me, it's calling out injustice. Is that something you would concur with, or?
Yeah, and that drives me crazy when people just think that the church isn't involved in social justice. You look at the continent of Africa, I think the Catholic Church is one of the biggest, if not the biggest providers of healthcare and education. When we went to South Sudan a few years ago, the newest country in the world, with civil wars, with killings, with murders, while other NGOs fled because it was too unsafe for the workers to stay there. Catholic Church remains, building schools, building hospitals. I interviewed the president of East Timor just a few months ago before the Pope went, and they had a bloody occupation by Indonesia where a third of their population was killed. And the president, sitting across from me, said, if it wasn't for the Catholic Church, I don't think we would have ever we wouldn't have survived the country. Hiding people, protecting people, using the power that it had as a voice for good. Now, of course, people will point to history. It hasn't always happened. Human beings are flawed. They make good decisions and they make terrible decisions. But I think for the most part, especially today, when you look around the world, whether you go to orphanages in Belarus affected by the radiation from Chernobyl, or you go to slums in Ecuador or Colombia, you go across Africa, the first secondary school for girls opened in South Sudan. As we're talking now, there's only one school just for girls in the whole country of South Sudan, pushed by the Catholic Church against huge resistance. Because even today they say a woman's place is to be educated until the end of primary school, and then once she hits puberty, she should be married off and exchanged for cows. And it's the Catholic Church coming in saying, no, they're equal to man, they have immense value, and they should be educated, and will put our money where our mouth is and build a school. We did a great piece with a nun from Birmingham, I think, Sister Imelda Poole, who works in the mountains of Albania, rescuing young girls from trafficking. And this is all what the church does. It's not made up, it's happening right now. We interviewed nuns once in South Korea who were helping mothers and their children who were escaping from North Korea through Beijing, and the mothers had to go into prostitution in Beijing because of this deal they had to work out with the gangs, but the nuns mind their children until they can come to South Korea. You talk about feminism. I mean, this is what the church is doing right now. If the church disappeared tomorrow, and your church as well, there would be a lot of people going without food, there would be a lot of people who don't get education, a lot of people without health care, and a lot of people in much dire positions. And that's just the reality of it.
Yeah, and thanks for saying it, because that's what people need to hear, particularly in my church right now, because I know there's a lot of people full of worry and doubt, and and just to hear you say that's really encouraging. So thank you. I just want to, this is Whiz by, Colm. I've loved chatting to you.
I'm sorry, I hope I haven't been waffling too much. It's the Irish waffle.
Yeah, no, most of it's been great. No, it's all been it's all been great, mate.
You might cut it down to 4 minutes or something.
Just me.
Yeah, just do. Give the audience what they want.
I want to ask about Pope Francis, Colm.
It's here now. I'll get him in. Papa.
Is it? No, seriously now. I look from afar at the Holy Father, and I see a very warm, gentle human being. Tell us about him from your experience, and what is the overriding quality of the man?
The overriding quality is being a pope for those on the margins and the poor. No doubt about it. Yesterday I was in the Apostolic Palace, where popes have lived for hundreds of years. A stunning, beautiful palace attached onto the Vatican, to St. Peter's Basilica. Pope Francis, when he became pope in 2013, said, I'm not going to live there. I'm going to live in a simple, humble apartment in another part of the Vatican. He said, the poor don't live in palaces. I won't live in palaces. Normally the Pope would take the summer off and go to the summer residence in Castel Gandolfo, an hour outside of Rome, to the summer papal palace. First Pope in modern history to refuse to do that. Instead of going to Catholic and Christian strongholds, going to France or going to different countries, he's picked countries like Papua New Guinea, like Mongolia, like Bahrain. He has gone to the edges. He said at the beginning he was going to be a pope for those in the peripheries, and that really has been the case. And also a pope for the time. You know, as we have such a problem with migrants all over the world and people fleeing persecution, and it's such a hot button issue, the Pope has made it his mission from the beginning to be there and speak on the plight of migrants. Other things, it's no rumour, it's no secret that he has divided some Catholics in terms of maybe changing the tone of the papacy, some of his declarations, some of his utterances. He hasn't changed dogma or theology, but just kind of taken a different approach to certain things. For example, recently when he was in Singapore, he answered a question from a young man. It was at an interreligious faith meeting, and the young man said, I'm Muslim, Holy Father, and sometimes I'm bullied because of my faith. And the Pope had a pre-prepared speech, but he stopped and he said, That's terrible. We should never bully each other. We should never say, my faith is better than yours or yours is better than mine. And people said, okay. And then he said, because all faiths, all religions lead to God. He said, every religion leads to God. And then he went on to mention some Hindu, Jewish, Muslim, Christianity. He said it's like all different languages, but we're saying the same thing. Now, on one hand, you had one half of the Catholic Church, maybe the more progressive half, who thought this is wonderful, what a charitable answer, and it's so beautiful, and it made everybody in the room of different faiths feel really nice in the moment. Then you have, on the other hand, the other side of the Catholic Church who are saying, but wait a second, did Jesus not say only through me you can be saved and have salvation? Why, like someone like my uncle, why does someone go and devote their life to evangelizing in Africa when they could have stayed at home and had a career and a family? Why do we celebrate martyrs? People, including in Iraq, where I just was, people who refused to convert and stand by their faith. If all faiths lead to God, why didn't they just cling to life and convert? It's all the one thing. So there's instances like that with Pope Francis where he'll say one thing, he'll say something else. They can often be contradictory, and that has caused some problems throughout his papacy. But all in all, I think with the abuse crisis that was engulfing the church, with the plight of migrants, you could say maybe the right pope for the right time. But we could be here all day if I was going to give you all the different opinions, and we hear them from our viewers.
Yeah, I'm
But
sure.
yeah, he is a divisive pope for people within the Catholic Church.
And maybe a final question, Colin. In the big world issues, you in the Holy Land, in Russia, Ukraine, and with a new president in America, what and how can he exert his influence in these areas?
That's a great question, Alex. And when I first started working at the Vatican, I thought, well, how busy is it going to be? Or, how much of a player is it on the global stage? And then you just realize every week you see different heads of state from countries, these flags I don't even recognize, I've never heard of before. Everybody wants to come and see the Pope because they recognize that he does have great influence and the Catholic Church still does have great influence. In fact, just next door to me is the British Embassy, not to Italy, but the British Embassy to the Holy See. Next door to it is the Angolan Embassy. You've got the Argentinian one, the Brazil, the Irish one. I think over 200 countries have embassies just to the Vatican. Because traditionally, if you think about influence, you look at countries that people can't even work with, like North Korea. The Catholic Church would have maybe some priests there, some monks, some missionaries, maybe a bishop. They're coming back to Rome. So the network is vast and it's huge and it's global and it's really grassroots in the community, in the schools and the hospitals. So the church still does have a huge influence and power. We see it waning in the West, but I was in Africa this year in Kenya and Uganda, and I interviewed the Archbishop of Nairobi in Kenya, and he said, Colm, we've got a crisis of vocations. And I said, wait, I thought we're the ones. He said, no, it's the opposite here. We've too many. We've too many young people and not enough places to put them. So they're booming. And again, like in South Sudan, young people see the Catholic Church as a force for good because of education, because of empowerment. So in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, still is incredibly, incredibly strong and powerful.
Fabulous, Colin. I've loved chatting to you. It's been great, mate. I really getting an insight into your work and the church. I hope people have enjoyed this. If you've enjoyed it, there's loads of guests on the Godcast, religious people from all walks of life, Catholics, Methodists, you name it. There's something for everybody. But Colin. Thanks, mate. Thanks for coming
I'm,
on, and congratulations on your recent announcement on X.
oh, my engagement.
Yeah,
And I was going to say as well, yeah, if people liked it, leave a comment and say you liked it. If you didn't like it, maybe just don't say anything. But it's right. I got engaged recently. The love of my life, Paula. We're getting married in just over a month in Ireland. So I'm a lucky guy.
well, God bless you, mate. I hope it goes well. I'm sure it will. And
Thank,
keep in touch. And thanks for coming on the Godcast.
thank you so much, Father Alex. We'll talk soon.